I simply cannot find her.
Maria?
She's missing from the Abbey again.
Perhaps we should have put a cowbell around her neck.
I have looked everywhere, in all of the usual places.
Considering that it's Maria, I suggest you look in someplace unusual.
There's a version of The Sound of Music that the world never got to see. Not because it was cut for time, or because the studio ran out of money, or because the story wasn't good enough. No, it was buried deliberately. Scenes that went wrong in the most spectacular ways. Moments of chaos, danger, and raw human emotion that the cameras captured, but the executives ordered everyone to forget. For decades, the cast and crew stayed quiet. Contracts were tight. Reputations were on the line. And the studio had every reason to protect the image of what had become the most beloved musical film in Hollywood history. But here's the thing about secrets. They never stay buried forever. One by one, over the span of decades, the truth started leaking out. Through memoirs, through late-night talk show confessions, through interviews given long after the contracts expired and the lawyers stopped watching. And what emerged was a story far more fascinating, far more human, and far more extraordinary than the polished, golden film that billions of people had seen on their screens. What you are about to hear is not the story of a perfect movie. It is the story of a production that nearly fell apart at least a dozen different times, in at least a dozen different ways, and somehow, against every reasonable expectation, produced something that would change cinema forever. Of all the stories that were locked away behind studio walls, perhaps none is more perfectly absurd than what happened during the filming of the gazebo scene. If you have seen The Sound of Music, and statistically, given that it sold close to 283 million tickets worldwide, there's a very good chance you have. Then you know this scene. It is the romantic centerpiece of the entire film. Maria and Captain Von Trapp, bathed in soft, silvery moonlight, standing in a glass gazebo while the camera captures the moment they finally confess their love. It is delicate. It is tender. It is one of the most iconic romantic moments in the history of cinema. It was also, by every account of those who were there, an absolute disaster to film. The problem did not come from the script. It did not come from the actors. It came from the equipment, specifically the massive industrial carbon arc lights that the crew had set up to simulate the gentle glow of moonlight through the gazebo windows. These were not small, quiet pieces of technology. They were enormous machines built for power rather than elegance, and they generated a tremendous amount of heat and noise. In particular, they generated a very specific kind of noise, a noise that, in the words of Julie Andrews herself when she finally described it publicly decades later, sounded exactly like a prolonged, wet, unmistakable bodily function. Every time the lights powered up, every time Christopher Plummer leaned in toward Andrews for the romantic moment the scene required, the machines below them let out what Andrews described as these awful raspberries coming at you from below. The first time it happened, it was startling. The second time, it was funny. By the fifth or sixth time, neither Andrews nor Plummer could hold themselves together. The crew was no better. Hardened film professionals who had worked on dozens of productions found themselves doubling over, unable to maintain the composure the director needed. Director Robert Wise called cut, reset the scene, and tried again, and again, and again. By some accounts, they attempted the scene more than 20 times. Each attempt ended the same way, with the lights making their unfortunate announcement at the worst possible moment, and with the entire set dissolving into helpless laughter. Hours passed. The budget was ticking. Wise, who was known for his patience and professionalism, eventually made a decision that would, accidentally, define one of the most visually striking shots in the film. He gave up on the bright lighting entirely. Instead, he repositioned Andrews and Plummer so that they were standing in front of the glowing windows of the gazebo, their faces turned mostly away from the camera, their figures rendered in romantic silhouette against the warm light behind them. The result looked intentional. It looked artistic. It looked like the work of a director who had planned every detail with enormous care. Film scholars would later praise the visual composition of that shot, pointing to it as evidence of Wise's sophisticated visual instincts. What those scholars did not know was that the shot existed because the original plan had been completely destroyed by a malfunctioning piece of industrial equipment that sounded to everyone on set like something that had no business being in a romance scene. The studio made sure the story stayed quiet. Cast and crew were given very clear instructions. The chaos of that evening was not to be discussed publicly. For years, audiences watching that moonlit scene had no idea that behind the glowing silhouettes, behind the soft music and the whispered confession of love, there had been hours of uncontrollable laughter and a piece of equipment behaving in the most undignified way imaginable. To understand the full story of what went on behind the scenes of The Sound of Music, you have to understand Christopher Plummer's relationship with this film, because it was, for most of the production and for many years afterward, a relationship built almost entirely on contempt. Plummer was a classically trained stage actor with a serious reputation. He had worked in Shakespeare. He had performed on the great theatrical stages of his generation. He had ambitions that ran toward the dark, the complex, the morally layered roles that challenged both actor and audience. The Sound of Music, with its singing nuns and cheerful children and relentlessly optimistic worldview, was precisely the kind of project he wanted nothing to do with. He turned down the role of Captain George Von Trapp multiple times. His private nickname for the film, one that he used freely among people he trusted, was the Sound of Mucus. He was not subtle about his feelings. What changed his mind was not a sudden appreciation for the material. It was Robert Wise, who flew to London specifically to make the case in person, and who offered Plummer the one thing that could get a serious actor interested in a family musical: the promise of creative input. Plummer told the writers that the captain was too flat, too rigid, too much of a cardboard authority figure. He wanted depth. He wanted scenes that showed a man capable of genuine vulnerability. He wanted, in particular, a song, something quiet and personal, something that would allow the captain to be human for a moment rather than simply imposing. That conversation produced Edelweiss. It is worth pausing on that fact because Edelweiss has become so thoroughly associated with Austrian culture that most people who watch the film assume it is a traditional folk song, something passed down through generations in the Alpine countryside. It is not. Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote it specifically because Christopher Plummer demanded a song that would give his character emotional depth. The song that feels most authentically Austrian in the entire film was invented by two American songwriters to satisfy an actor who thought the whole project was sentimental nonsense. And yet, Plummer hated the experience anyway. He found the location shooting in Salzburg suffocating. He described the city, despite its genuine beauty, as feeling like a kind of prison of forced cheerfulness. He drank heavily throughout the production, a fact he later admitted openly and without apparent shame in his memoir, published in 2008. He described gaining weight, isolating himself, and struggling to connect emotionally with a story that felt completely alien to his artistic sensibilities. The cruelest irony of his experience on the film comes in one specific scene. The moment during the Salzburg Festival when Captain Von Trapp sings Edelweiss, and the emotion in his eyes is so raw and so real that audiences frequently cite it as one of the most moving moments in the film. People watch that scene and see a man who loves his country, who is quietly heartbroken at what is happening to it, who is summoning every ounce of dignity he has to stand up and sing in the face of encroaching evil. It is beautiful. It is devastating. It is, by any measure, extraordinary acting. Plummer was drunk when they filmed it. He said so himself. The profound, moving performance that generations of viewers have pointed to as proof of his character's transformation was delivered by a man who had been drinking and who, by his own admission, had very little personal investment in the emotional truth the scene was supposed to represent. Whether this says something remarkable about his natural gifts as an actor or simply about the strange alchemy of filmmaking is a question worth sitting with. There was one more indignity waiting for him. The singing voice that audiences hear in the film during the captain's extended musical moments is not entirely Plummer's. A professional session singer named Bill Lee, who had also contributed vocal work to several major Disney productions, provided the more demanding vocal passages. Plummer was told his voice alone would not carry the musical requirements of the role. He was furious. He felt it was a direct commentary on his abilities, and it stung in a way that the general misery of the production had not quite managed to. Millions of viewers would watch Captain Von Trapp sing and believe they were hearing Christopher Plummer. For decades, most of them had no idea. The chaos behind The Sound of Music was not always funny. Some of it was genuinely frightening. The opening sequence of the film, Julie Andrews spinning through a mountain meadow with her arms spread wide, the camera sweeping overhead in a breathtaking aerial shot, is probably the single most recognizable image associated with the film. It appears on posters. It has been parodied and referenced and replicated thousands of times in the decades since. It represents, in a single visual, everything the movie promises: freedom, joy, wide open spaces, and the overwhelming beauty of the natural world. To achieve that shot, a helicopter had to fly approximately 20 feet above Andrews while she performed. 20 feet is not very high. The rotor blades of a helicopter at 20 feet generate an enormous amount of downward wind force, enough, as Andrews discovered, to physically knock a person flat. Every single time the helicopter made a pass over her position, the wind slammed her to the ground. She was knocked down at least 6 times during filming. Each time, she had to get back up, smooth her dress, reset her position, spread her arms, and smile as though she were experiencing the most transcendent moment of her life. Then the helicopter would come around again, and she would be knocked flat once more. Andrews later recounted the experience with characteristic humor, describing it as feeling like being tackled repeatedly by something invisible. The scene that millions of people associate with effortless, soaring joy was filmed by an actress who spent most of her time on the grass. But of everything that went wrong physically during the production, nothing was more genuinely dangerous than what happened to the youngest member of the cast during the boat scene. Kim Carruth was 5 years old when she was cast as Gretel, the youngest Von Trapp child. She was small, she was sweet, and she could not swim. This last fact was known to the production team before filming began. The plan was straightforward. When the boat tipped over and the children fell into the water, Andrews would fall toward Gretel and pull her to safety immediately. It did not work out that way. When the boat capsized, Andrews fell backward rather than forward, away from the child.